Right now, somewhere on your porch or patio, there is an empty container. And every single day it sits empty in August, it's costing you a harvest you could be eating in October. Here's the thing, most container gardeners never realize. Spring gets all the attention. Everyone rushes to fill their pots in April and May, and by the time August arrives, a lot of people assume the growing season is basically over. They let their containers sit empty, or worse, they leave dead summer plants in there until frost tells them to clean up. But August is not the end of the container season. For a specific group of crops, it's actually one of the best planting windows of the entire year. Cooler nights are coming. The harsh, wilting heat of midsummer is starting to ease off. And that combination is exactly what a certain kind of crop has been waiting for. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through 9 crops that belong in a container this August, counting down to the one crop that, more than any other, rewards a gardener who plants it right now instead of waiting. Some of these will surprise you. A couple of them people plant constantly but get completely wrong in a pot. And the one at the very end is the crop I'd tell a beginner to start with if they could only plant one thing this month. Before we get into the list, if you've got containers sitting around right now, drop a comment and tell me how many you're working with and what climate you're gardening in, because that actually changes which of these 9 make the most sense for you. It also helps me know what to cover in future videos. So if you're new here, take a second to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the fall container series that's coming up after this. All right, let's get into it. Starting at 9, we have Asian greens, especially bok choy and tatsoi. I'm putting these at 9 not because they're weak crops, but because they reward a very specific kind of attention that not every container gardener wants to give. Asian greens are some of the fastest growing vegetables you can put in a pot, and August planting works beautifully for them, because the plant that struggles in summer heat suddenly thrives once temperatures start dropping. Bok choy and tatsoi are notorious for bolting, which means shooting up a flower stalk and turning bitter when they're grown in hot weather. Plant them now, as the heat breaks, and you sidestep that problem almost entirely. In a container, these greens do well in something around 12 inches wide and at least 8 inches deep, since their root systems stay fairly compact. Drainage matters a lot here, because Asian greens hate sitting in soggy soil, so make sure whatever you're using has real drainage holes and isn't just decorative. You can direct sow the seeds about 1/4 inch deep, spacing them roughly 6 inches apart, or start them from small transplants if you want a head start. They like 4 to 6 hours of sunlight a day, which makes them a good option for a container that gets strong morning sun but some afternoon shade. And consistent watering is key, since shallow containers dry out fast in warm August soil. Use a light, well-draining potting mix rather than heavy garden soil, which tends to compact in containers and suffocate these fine root systems. You can expect baby leaves in as little as 3 to 4 weeks, with full heads ready around 6 to 8 weeks, depending on your climate. As fall temperatures settle in, these greens actually get sweeter, and you can keep harvesting outer leaves for weeks, while the center keeps producing. The biggest mistake gardeners make with Asian greens in containers is overcrowding the seedlings and never thinning them, which leaves every plant fighting for the same tiny pocket of soil and produces stunted, tough leaves. Thin early, even though it feels wasteful, and you'll get noticeably better heads. That's a strong start. But the next crop on the list is one almost everyone has grown before, and almost nobody grows correctly in a container. At 8, we have radishes. Radishes get a bit of a reputation as a beginner crop, and in some ways that's fair. But that reputation causes people to underestimate how well they actually fit into an August container setup. Radishes are one of the fastest vegetables you can grow, and August planting lines up perfectly with their preference for cool soil, since the roots can turn woody and sharp-tasting when they mature during hot weather. For containers, depth matters more than width with radishes. You want at least 6 to 8 inches of soil depth, so the root has room to swell without hitting the bottom of the pot. But the container itself can be fairly narrow and still work well, which makes radishes a great choice for smaller pots tucked into gaps on a patio. Direct sow the seeds about ½ an inch deep, spacing them roughly 2 inches apart, since radishes don't transplant well, and disturbing their roots early tends to cause misshapen bulbs later. They want 4 to 6 hours of sunlight and prefer soil that stays evenly moist, because inconsistent watering is actually the single biggest reason radishes turn out cracked or overly spicy. Use a loose, sandy, well-draining mix, since compacted soil is one of the fastest ways to end up with twisted, forked roots instead of clean round ones. Depending on the variety, you can be harvesting in as little as 3 to 4 weeks, which makes radishes one of the quickest wins on this entire list. As the weather cools further, radishes actually hold in the ground, or in this case the container, longer without going woody, giving you a wider harvest window than a summer planting would allow. A reliable variety for August is Cherry Belle, which matures fast and handles cooler soil well. The biggest mistake with container radishes is overcrowding the seeds and skipping thinning, which leaves you with beautiful green tops and disappointing, undersized roots underneath. One tip that makes a real difference is sowing a small new batch every couple of weeks through August, so instead of one big harvest all at once, you get a steady, staggered supply. Radishes get you fast results, but the next crop on the list plays a longer game, and it's one that a lot of gardeners assume needs a full garden bed to succeed. At 7, we have beets. Beets earn their spot here because they give you 2 harvests from one planting, the roots and the greens, and August timing is almost ideal for them in most temperate climates, since beets handle cool weather far better than summer heat, which tends to make the roots tough and stringy. In a container, beets need a bit more room than people expect, largely because of that root that swells underground. A pot around 12 to 14 inches wide and at least 10 to 12 inches deep gives the roots enough space to develop properly without becoming stunted or misshapen. Direct sow beet seeds about ½ an inch deep, and here's something specific to beets that trips people up. What looks like a single seed is actually a small cluster, so you'll often get multiple seedlings from one spot and need to thin them to about 3 to 4 inches apart once they sprout. Beets want 4 to 6 hours of sunlight, and while they tolerate a bit less than full sun, growth slows noticeably in heavier shade. Keep the soil consistently moist, since dry spells cause the roots to become woody, and use a loose, well-draining mix free of large clumps or rocks, because compacted or obstructed soil is one of the main reasons container-grown beets come out twisted or split. You can expect to start harvesting beet greens within about 3 to 4 weeks, while the roots themselves typically take somewhere around 8 weeks, depending on the variety and your local conditions. Cooler fall weather actually improves beet flavor, since a light chill encourages the plant to convert starches into sugars, giving you sweeter roots than a summer harvest would. A dependable variety for container growing is Detroit Dark Red, which handles confined root space well. The most common mistake is skipping the thinning step, since overcrowded beets compete for the same limited soil volume and end up small and underdeveloped. A tip that consistently improves results is harvesting a few outer greens along the way without disturbing the root, giving you fresh salad greens, while the beet itself keeps growing underneath. There's something genuinely satisfying about pulling a beet out of a container you planted in August and realizing you grew both the root and the greens from a single pot on your porch. The next crop takes a bit more patience, but it rewards that patience with one of the most reliable fall harvests on this list. At 6, we have broccoli. Broccoli sits solidly in the middle of this countdown because it's genuinely productive in containers, but it asks more of the grower than the crops we've covered so far, both in terms of container size and ongoing care. August is prime planting time for broccoli in many regions because it needs to mature during cooler weather. Broccoli that heads up during a hot spell tends to bolt early or produce small, loose, unsatisfying heads instead of the tight one you're picturing. This is where container size becomes genuinely important. Broccoli develops a substantial root system to support that large central head, so you want a container that holds at least 5 gallons of soil, with a depth of 12 to 14 inches at minimum. Trying to grow broccoli in anything smaller consistently produces stunted plants with tiny heads because the roots simply run out of room to support the top growth. It's usually best to start with transplants rather than direct sowing seeds, especially this late in the season, since transplants give you a several-week head start toward maturity before colder weather arrives. Space plants about 15 to 18 inches apart if you're using a larger container with multiple plants, and set transplants at the same depth they were growing in their original pot. Broccoli wants a minimum of 6 hours of sunlight, and consistent watering matters enormously here, since inadequate moisture during head formation is one of the most common reasons for small or bitter heads. Use a rich, well-draining potting mix, and consider working in some compost at planting time, since broccoli is a heavier feeder than most of the crops on this list. Depending on your climate and the variety, expect somewhere around 10 to 12 weeks from transplant to harvest, though this varies quite a bit by region, so pay attention to your local first frost date when deciding whether August planting will give the plant enough time. Broccoli genuinely prefers cool weather, and a light frost late in the season won't harm it and can even improve flavor. One underrated advantage of container broccoli is that after you cut the main head, many varieties will continue producing smaller side shoots for weeks afterward, extending your harvest well beyond that first cut. A reliable variety for fall containers is Belstar. The biggest mistake gardeners make is underestimating the container size broccoli needs and cramming it into something too small, which caps the plant's potential before it even gets started. The tip that helps most is checking your average first frost date before you plant, so you know whether you're giving the plant enough runway to mature. Broccoli asks for patience and a bigger pot, but the next crop flips that entirely. It's fast, forgiving, and one of the most underrated containers crops for anyone who wants color and nutrition without much fuss. At 5, we have Swiss chard. Chard earns a spot in the top half of this list because of one specific advantage container gardeners tend to underestimate. It's a cut-and-come-again crop that can keep producing for months, sometimes well past what you'd expect from a single August planting. Chard tolerates both warm and cool weather better than most greens, but planting in August means the plant will be maturing right as temperatures moderate, which tends to produce better texture and milder flavor than a midsummer planting. For containers, chard does well in a pot around 12 to 14 inches wide and at least 10 inches deep, giving the roots enough depth to support a plant that can keep growing for a long stretch. You can direct sow seeds about ½ an inch deep, spacing them roughly 6 to 8 inches apart, or use transplants if you want to shorten the time to first harvest. Chard wants 4 to 6 hours of sunlight, though it tolerates partial shade better than many crops on this list, which makes it a flexible option for a container spot that doesn't get full sun all day. Keep the soil evenly moist, since chard's broad leaves lose water quickly, especially if your container is still sitting somewhere warm early in August. A well-draining potting mix works well, and chard responds nicely to a bit of compost mixed in at planting time. You can typically begin harvesting outer leaves within about 4 to 5 weeks, and because you're only removing individual leaves rather than pulling the whole plant, a single chard plant in a decent-sized container can keep producing for months. Cooler fall weather actually suits chard extremely well, and established plants can tolerate a light frost without much damage, often continuing to produce right up until a harder freeze. A reliable variety is Bright Lights, which also happens to look striking in a container, thanks to its colorful stems. The most common mistake is harvesting the entire plant at once instead of taking outer leaves as needed, which cuts short what could have been months of ongoing harvests. The tip that makes the biggest difference is always harvesting from the outside in, leaving the center growth point intact, so the plant keeps producing new leaves from the middle. Chard is the kind of crop that quietly keeps feeding you all fall while you forget it's even there, which is exactly the kind of low-effort, high-reward crop container gardening should be about. That's the halfway point of the list, and if one of these 5 has already got you thinking about a container you want to fill, drop a quick comment and let me know which one. It genuinely helps me plan out what to cover next. Now we're moving into the crops that most people already grow, but very few grow with real intention, starting with one you've probably planted a dozen times without thinking much about it. At 4, we have lettuce. Lettuce sits near the top of this list because it might be the single most forgiving crop for a container gardener, and August planting solves the one problem that ruins lettuce more than anything else, which is heat. Lettuce grown during hot weather tends to bolt quickly and turn bitter, but an August planting matures as temperatures ease, giving you the crisp, mild lettuce you're actually picturing when you think of a fresh salad. Container requirements for lettuce are refreshingly simple. A pot around 10 to 12 inches wide and just 6 to 8 inches deep is enough, since lettuce has a shallow root system compared to almost everything else on this list, which also makes it a great option for wide, shallow containers or even repurposed trays. You can direct sow seeds just a 1/4 inch deep, or use small transplants for a faster start. For loose leaf varieties, spacing of about 4 to 6 inches works well, while head lettuce needs closer to 8 to 10 inches to develop properly. Lettuce wants 4 to 6 hours of sunlight, and like chard, tolerates some afternoon shade, which can actually help protect it if you still have some lingering late summer heat in your area. Because the roots are shallow, consistent moisture is critical, since lettuce in a shallow container can dry out surprisingly fast, especially on warm August afternoons. Use a light, well-draining potting mix, and don't be afraid to water more frequently than you would with deeper-rooted crops. Loose-leaf lettuce can be ready to start harvesting in as little as 3 to 4 weeks, while head-forming varieties take closer to 6 to 8 weeks. Lettuce genuinely improves in cooler fall weather, developing better texture and flavor than it ever would in summer, and can often tolerate a light frost, especially hardier varieties. A dependable choice for fall containers is black-seeded Simpson, which is fast, reliable, and cold-tolerant. The most common mistake is treating lettuce like it needs deep soil, the way root crops do, and using an unnecessarily deep, heavy container that then becomes harder to keep consistently moist. The tip that pays off the most is harvesting loose-leaf lettuce by cutting outer leaves rather than pulling the whole plant, which lets it keep regrowing for weeks. There's a particular kind of satisfaction in stepping outside, snipping a few leaves of lettuce you grew yourself, and having a salad on the table 20 minutes later, and lettuce is one of the easiest crops on this entire list to get to that point. But the next crop takes a bit more patience than lettuce, and it rewards that patience with something few other container crops can offer. At 3, we have carrots. Carrots earn a high spot on this list because container growing actually solves one of the most common problems people run into with carrots in the ground, which is heavy or rocky soil that causes roots to fork, twist, or stay stubby. In a container, you control the soil completely, which means you can give carrots exactly the loose, obstruction-free environment they need to grow long and straight. August planting works well for carrots because they mature during cooler weather, and like beets, a bit of cool temperature late in their growth actually sweetens the flavor. Depth is the single most important factor for container carrots, more than for almost anything else on this list. You need at least 12 inches of soil depth for most standard varieties, and if you want to grow longer carrots, closer to 16 inches gives better results. Anything shallower and the roots hit the bottom of the container and either stop growing or twist sideways, looking for room. Direct sow the seeds about a 1/4 inch deep, since carrots don't transplant well at all, and disturbing the taproot early almost always leads to a forked, misshapen root later. Space seedlings about 2 to 3 inches apart after thinning, which is a step you really can't skip with carrots. They want 6 hours of sunlight, and consistent, even moisture matters enormously, since inconsistent watering is one of the leading causes of cracked carrots. Use a loose, sandy, well-draining mix, completely free of rocks, sticks, or heavy clumps, since carrots are extremely sensitive to any obstruction in the soil. You can expect harvest somewhere around 10 to 12 weeks, depending on the variety, and shorter varieties bred for containers tend to mature a bit faster than long standard types. As fall temperatures drop, carrots left in the container often taste noticeably sweeter, and many varieties can handle a light frost without any damage, which means you're not racing a hard deadline the way you are with some other crops. A variety specifically worth mentioning for containers is a shorter type, like Danvers Half Long, or a round variety like Paris Market, both of which handle limited depth better than long, tapering varieties. The biggest mistake with container carrots is skipping the thinning step, since crowded carrots fight each other for space underground and come out small, twisted, or barely formed. The tip that improves results the most is keeping the top inch of soil consistently damp right after sowing. Since carrot seeds are slow to germinate, and dry surface soil is one of the main reasons for spotty, uneven sprouting. Carrots take real patience, and I want you to hold on to that thought, because the next crop on this list is one that a lot of people underestimate, simply because it seems too ordinary. But containers actually give it a genuine advantage over growing it in the ground. At 2, we have spinach. Spinach might be the crop on this list most specifically designed, by nature, for August planting. It's famously sensitive to heat and daylight, bolting almost immediately if grown during long, hot summer days. But in August planting times, the plant's growth to line up with shortening days and cooling temperatures, which is exactly what spinach wants. This alone makes it one of the better choices for a fresh planting this month, rather than something you'd normally start in spring. In containers, spinach does well in a pot around 10 to 12 inches wide and 8 inches deep, since its root system is fairly shallow and compact compared to root crops. Direct sow seeds about 1/2 inch deep, spacing them roughly 3 to 4 inches apart. Spinach can handle a bit less direct sun than many crops on this list, doing well with 4 to 6 hours, and actually benefits from some afternoon shade if you're planting early in August, while temperatures are still warm in your area. Keep the soil consistently moist, since spinach has a shallow, fine root system that dries out quickly, and use a rich, well-draining potting mix, since spinach appreciates a bit more fertility than some of the lighter feeders on this list. You can typically begin harvesting baby spinach leaves in about 3 to 4 weeks, with more mature leaves ready around 6 weeks. This is where spinach genuinely shines in a container setup: cold tolerance. Established spinach plants can survive surprisingly hard frosts, And in many regions, a well-situated container of spinach can keep producing leaves well into late fall or even early winter, especially if you can move or shelter the container during the coldest nights. A reliable variety for fall growing is Bloomsdale Long-Standing, known for its cold hardiness and productivity. The most common mistake with container spinach is planting it too early in the heat of summer, which causes it to bolt before you get a real harvest. So waiting until temperatures genuinely start easing off matters more with spinach than with almost anything else on this list. The tip that extends your harvest the most is picking outer leaves regularly rather than waiting for the whole plant to mature, which keeps the plant producing new growth from the center for weeks longer. Spinach rewards timing more than almost any other crop on this list. And if you get that timing right, it will keep feeding you long after most of your summer containers have been cleared away. Which brings us to the crop I'd put at the very top of this list. The one that, if you only plant one thing in a container this August, I'd tell you to plant this. At 1, we have kale. Kale takes the top spot because it combines nearly every advantage we've talked about across this entire list into a single crop. It's productive, forgiving, thrives specifically in the conditions August creates, and keeps producing longer than almost anything else you could put in a pot. August planting lines up perfectly with kale's biology, since it actually grows sweeter and more tender as temperatures drop. Unlike crops that merely tolerate the cold, kale genuinely improves because of it. In a container, kale needs a bit more room than the smaller greens on this list, since a single plant can grow quite large and keep producing for months. A pot around 14 inches wide and at least 12 inches deep gives the roots enough space to support that long-term growth. You can direct sow seeds about 1/4 to 1/2 inch deep or use transplants for a faster start, spacing plants roughly 12 to 18 inches apart if you're growing more than one in a larger container. Kale wants 6 hours of sunlight for the best growth, though it tolerates a bit less than that, better than most crops here. Keep the soil consistently moist and use a well-draining potting mix enriched with some compost, since kale is a fairly heavy feeder that rewards a bit of extra fertility. You can begin harvesting baby leaves in as little as 3 weeks, with more substantial harvests from 4 to 6 weeks onward. And here's the real advantage. Because kale is a cut-and-come-again crop with genuinely excellent cold tolerance, a single well-cared-for container can keep producing leaves for months, often surviving frosts that would end most other crops on this list, sometimes lasting well into winter in milder climates. A reliable variety for containers is Dwarf Blue Curled, which stays compact enough for pot culture while remaining highly productive. The biggest mistake gardeners make with container kale is harvesting too aggressively too early, stripping a young plant before it's established enough to support regrowth, which weakens it, right when it should be building toward months of production. The tip that makes the biggest long-term difference is always leaving the central growing point untouched and only harvesting the outer, lower leaves, which allows the plant to keep pushing out new growth from the top for as long as conditions allow. That's the full list, and if you've been following along, you can probably see why kale takes the top position. It's not just that it survives the cold, it's that an August planting sets kale up to become the one container on your porch that's still producing fresh, sweet greens long after everything else has finished for the year. So take a look at the containers you've got sitting around right now. August isn't a dead zone in the gardening calendar, it's a genuine second planting window, and the right crop, in the right container, planted at the right depth, with the right care, can turn an empty pot into a harvest you're still pulling from in November. Between Asian greens, radishes, beets, broccoli, chard, lettuce, carrots, spinach, and kale, there's almost certainly something on this list that fits the space you already have. Tell me in the comments which of these 9 you're planning to plant this August, And if you're only picking one, I'd genuinely like to know whether you're going with the fast win of radishes or committing to kale for the long haul. And if this helped you look at your containers a little differently, subscribe for more practical, no-nonsense container gardening advice, because there's a lot more useful planting information coming as we move deeper into fall.